What if one island, smaller than most American cities, held the financial spine of an entire nation's war machine? And what if, after 13 straight nights of warnings, that island was gone? If you want to understand what's really happening in the Persian Gulf right now, not the version filtered through politics, not the version softened for prime time, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who still thinks oil prices are just numbers that change on their own. Because what happened here isn't just a military story, it's an economic earthquake, and the aftershocks are heading somewhere much closer to home than you might think. Let's start with a place most people have never heard of, Kharg Island, a thin strip of land sitting roughly 25 miles off Iran's southwestern coast in the northern Persian Gulf. You wouldn't notice it on a globe. You'd barely notice it on a regional map. It doesn't have a famous skyline. It doesn't have a significant civilian population. It doesn't have walls or a massive military garrison protecting its perimeter. What it has is infrastructure, pipelines, deepwater jetties, loading arms, giant pumping systems engineered to pull crude oil out of the ground beneath Iranian soil, move it across dozens of miles of pipeline, and load it directly into the holds of some of the largest tankers ever built. And here's the number that explains why this island matters more than almost any other piece of real estate in this entire conflict. Roughly 90% of Iran's crude oil exports pass through Kharg Island before they reach any buyer anywhere on Earth. Not some of it, not most of it. 9 out of every 10 barrels that Iran sells to the outside world flow through this one narrow terminal first. Think about what that means for a government that has been funding a war for over a year. The money that pays the soldiers, the money that keeps missile programs running, the money that flows to proxy forces across the region, the money that prevents Iran's currency from completely collapsing under the weight of sustained sanctions. Almost all of it originates from crude oil that has to pass through Kharg before it becomes revenue. There is no equivalent backup sitting offshore somewhere ready to absorb that volume. Smaller export terminals exist. Bandar Imam Khomeini on the mainland, Lavan Island, Siri Island, but none of them individually, and not even all of them operating simultaneously at full capacity, can replace what Kharg alone moves in a single week. That is not a military vulnerability in the traditional sense. It is an economic choke point. A single structural dependency so severe that for decades it was treated as untouchable, not because striking it was technically difficult, but because of what happens after the missiles land. When you hit a military site, the damage is largely self-contained. Supply chains can be rebuilt through allies. Spare parts can be sourced quietly. A radar installation can be replaced in months if the political will exists to do it. But when you strike the mechanism through which 90% of a nation's oil revenue moves, you are not just damaging a facility. You are threatening to fundamentally alter what that country can sell, to whom, and at what price for years into the future. That kind of damage does not stay contained. It ripples outward through global commodity markets. And global commodity markets connect to the fuel price at your nearest gas station. They connect to the heating bill that arrives in October. They connect to the price tags on ordinary goods at an ordinary store in an ordinary neighborhood that has no idea any of this is happening. That is the weight this island has always carried. And for most of this conflict, American planners treated Kharg's core export infrastructure as a line they were not prepared to cross, precisely because of how far the consequences would travel once they did. That restraint lasted right up until the moment it didn't. Now let's talk about the 13 nights, because the most important part of what happened at Kharg Island isn't just the strike itself, it's what came before it. Night after night, through public statements and military signaling, through the specific language governments use when they want an adversary to understand exactly what is coming without revealing the precise timing. Washington made its intentions unmistakable. Kharg Island, the export infrastructure, the financial base that keeps this war funded. Each warning was specific. Each warning added pressure to the one before it. Each warning gave Iran's leadership another opportunity to disperse assets, reduce its exposure, take some kind of action that might reduce the damage of a strike everyone watching closely could see was building toward execution. For 13 consecutive nights, Iran did not move. Sit with that for a moment, because it contains almost everything important about the political and strategic reality Iran found itself in. When a government receives direct, repeated public warnings about a named target over nearly 2 weeks and still fails to act, there are really only 2 explanations worth taking seriously. The first is that Iran's leadership believed the warnings were theater. Governments use the threat of force as a negotiating tool constantly. If you have survived enough rounds of escalating rhetoric without a real follow-through, it becomes rational, if dangerous, to assume the pattern will repeat. That the pressure is designed to extract concessions at a table somewhere rather than execute a military plan waiting in operational readiness. The second explanation is quieter, more unsettling, and probably more accurate. Iran may have understood the warnings as completely credible. and still concluded that moving its assets created a more serious danger than simply absorbing the strike. Think about what that means. Maybe there was genuinely nowhere safer to relocate that kind of specialized infrastructure. Maybe any visible attempt to disperse or protect Kharg's export operations would have broadcast weakness at the exact moment weakness invites escalation rather than relief. Maybe the calculation was never really about whether the strike was coming. Maybe it was about which version of the incoming damage was survivable, and whether showing fear before the blow would guarantee a worse outcome than absorbing the blow without flinching. A country that holds still after 13 consecutive direct public warnings is not a country that failed to understand what was happening. It is a country that ran complex calculations in rooms none of us will ever see, reached conclusions we cannot fully know, and decided that its remaining options were far narrower than anyone watching from the outside understood. And then the 13th night ended, and the strike landed. Let's talk about what was actually hit, because precision matters enormously here for understanding what recovery actually looks like. This strike was not indiscriminate. It did not target residential areas on the island. It did not hit the surrounding shipping lanes used by general marine traffic passing through the northern Gulf. What it struck was the operational core, the loading infrastructure, the pumping systems, the specific mechanisms that physically move crude oil from underground pipeline networks into the holds of waiting tankers. That targeting choice changes everything about what comes next. A strike on military hardware can often be addressed through military logistics, spare parts moved through allies, replacement equipment sourced from states willing to work around sanctions. The damage can be painful without being permanent. A strike on specialized export infrastructure is an entirely different category of problem. It requires precision-engineered components. It requires replacement parts originally designed and certified to specific operational standards by companies that are legally barred from supplying Iran with anything at all under current sanctions law. Iran has built genuine domestic engineering capability over the past decade, specifically because it anticipated that outside assistance would remain unavailable indefinitely. That capability is real and should not be dismissed. Iran has kept aging infrastructure operational through careful maintenance and domestic ingenuity for years in ways that surprised outside analysts more than once. But there is a meaningful, measurable gap between maintaining worn equipment through careful upkeep and rebuilding infrastructure that was deliberately, precisely targeted for maximum disruption. That gap is not measured in days. Realistically, it is not even measured in weeks. It is measured in months at minimum, and that estimate assumes Iran can source what it needs through supply relationships that are already under strain from the duration of this war. There is a principle worth holding on to here because it reaches far beyond Kharg Island. You can destroy in 30 minutes something that took 30 years to design, build, and calibrate. You cannot rebuild that same capacity in 30 months if the certified replacement parts remain sanctioned and the engineers who understand the system best are legally barred from coming anywhere near the facility. That asymmetry, the gap between how fast destruction travels and how slow reconstruction moves under sanctions, is the real story sitting underneath the smoke over the Persian Gulf right now. You've been watching this story unfold with us, and it's about to get even more important. Before we go further, take 3 seconds and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. It takes you nothing. It helps this channel reach more people who need to understand what's actually driving global energy markets right now. Tell a friend, forward this. The more people who understand what Kharg Island actually is, the better the conversation gets. Now let's talk about why Washington chose this specific moment. For most of this conflict, American strategy operated inside a consistent set of constraints. Strike the Revolutionary Guard, strike missile sites, radar networks, drone launch positions. Hit the military architecture that makes Iran's offensive capabilities function, but stay away from infrastructure with direct and immediate global commodity market consequences. Because once that boundary is crossed, the economic and diplomatic fallout becomes genuinely difficult to contain regardless of how justified the original military rationale was. That boundary held for months through repeated public warnings that never turned into kinetic action. Governments watching from Beijing to Riyadh to Moscow noted the pattern carefully and drew their own conclusions about where American red lines actually sat. It no longer holds. What this strike represents is not simply a tactical decision about one target on one night. It is a threshold decision, the kind of strategic choice that signals a fundamental recalculation about what costs are acceptable in pursuit of a defined outcome. And every government watching this conflict, whether or not they have a single soldier anywhere near the Persian Gulf, is now processing what that threshold shift means for their own planning and their own exposure. The Gulf monarchies with energy infrastructure of their own have been watching very carefully. Beijing, which has remained Iran's most consistent buyer of discounted crude throughout this entire conflict, is watching closely. Moscow, which has spent years constructing its own parallel logistics for exporting sanctioned oil and has built real operational relationships with Iran around those systems, is watching closely. 2. Every one of them just watched the rules of what constitutes an acceptable military target shift in real time. That is not a regional signal, that is a global one, and the full implications of it are still traveling outward. Let's put some economic weight on this, because the financial dimension of the Kharg strike needs to be understood clearly before the strategic analysis makes complete sense. Iran's oil revenue throughout this war has never moved through the open market in any conventional sense. It flows through intermediaries. It is sold at steep discounts to buyers willing to work around international sanctions. It is routed through logistics channels specifically designed to stay beneath the visibility threshold of Western financial monitoring. Ship-to-ship transfers in international waters, shell companies layered across multiple jurisdictions, payment structures routed through currencies and banking systems operating outside American reach. But even under those severely constrained conditions, Kharg was still moving oil every single day. Not at the volumes Iran exported before sanctions tightened meaningfully. Not at the prices it once commanded on the open market. But consistently enough to prevent the government's operating budget from collapsing outright. Consistently enough to fund military campaigns, maintain proxy networks, and sustain weapons programs that have defined every phase of this war since it began. The precise fraction of Iran's current operating revenue that was flowing through Kharg at the exact moment that strike landed remains genuinely uncertain, even among analysts with access to the best satellite imagery and financial tracking tools available. The informal, sanctions evasion nature of Iran's oil trade means precise revenue figures are always estimates rather than confirmed data. What is not uncertain is who is watching most carefully right now. China has been Iran's most significant buyer of discounted crude throughout this conflict. Chinese officials are monitoring Kharg's operational status closely. This week, and the implications for their ongoing energy import arrangements are being assessed at levels of government that rarely show up in public statements. India's refineries, which have maintained limited unadvertised purchase arrangements with Iranian oil intermediaries, are running the same calculations behind closed doors. The oil itself has not disappeared. The underground reserves that make Kharg valuable are still sitting beneath Iranian soil exactly where they always were. What has been damaged, potentially severely, is the mechanism for getting that oil out of the ground onto a tanker and into the global supply system. And that distinction matters enormously for markets that depend on predictable, consistent supply to function efficiently. Commodity markets do not wait for official damage assessments before reacting. They price in uncertainty almost immediately because uncertainty itself carries a real cost. The inability to tell the buyer at the next link in the supply chain what volumes will look like 60 or 90 days from now. The inability to plan refinery schedules around confirmed delivery timelines. The inability to hedge effectively against a shortage with no confirmed end date. We have watched this mechanism play out before. Oil prices moving within. Hours of satellite images showing infrastructure damage, long before any ground-level assessment reached public reporting. Long before any official statement confirmed or denied the scope of what had happened. Kharg is structurally different from a shipping lane a tanker can reroute around with enough advance notice. It is not a processing facility with a convenient backup sitting idle in reserve. It is, quite literally, the primary mechanism through which the overwhelming majority of Iran's crude enters the global supply system. And the chain that connects this island to the lives of ordinary people reaches much further than most of those people realize. Gasoline prices connect to it. Heating costs connect to it. Shipping costs that ripple through import prices on goods sitting on shelves thousands of miles from the Persian Gulf connect to it. For someone managing a fixed income, someone who feels every fuel price movement before any official report acknowledges what's happening, this is not a distant headline about a foreign conflict. This is next week's number at the pump. This is the heating bill arriving 2 months from now. This is a quiet cost that no government official is going to stand up and directly acknowledge, even though it traces in a straight line back to decisions made in rooms very far from any gas station. Now let's turn to the part of this story that actually determines where everything goes from here, because the strike on Kharg does not end this conflict. It forces Iran into a decision, and the decision Iran makes in the coming days and weeks will shape the next chapter of this war more than almost anything that has happened so far. Iran realistically has 4 paths available to it in the immediate aftermath of a strike of this magnitude. Each carries its own logic, each carries its own set of risks, and understanding all 4 is the only way to genuinely understand what you should be watching for as this situation develops. The first path is the one Iran has threatened most publicly throughout this conflict: a total closure of the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. Not selective. Harassment of specific vessels. not new transit fees imposed on particular carriers, a complete shutdown of marine traffic through the single most important energy choke point on the planet. Roughly 20% of the world's seaborne oil moves through the strait on an ordinary day. Closing it would not simply escalate a regional conflict. It would convert Iran's image almost overnight from a country absorbing sustained military pressure into a country actively engineering a global economic crisis. And here is why this option is far more complicated than it appears in public rhetoric. Closing the strait doesn't only damage Iran's adversaries, it destroys Iran's own remaining export pathways. Every alternative route Iran would need for any meaningful economic recovery runs through the same waterway it would be shutting down. It converts Gulf monarchies that have stayed quietly sympathetic to Iran throughout this conflict into direct victims of a decision made entirely in Tehran. It provides every government that has been reluctant to publicly take sides with an immediate, concrete justification for doing exactly that. The threat of closing Hormuz has strategic value as long as it remains a threat. Executing it converts all of that leverage into immediate, uncontrollable consequences that fall on Iran as much as on anyone else. This is the option that generates the loudest headlines. It is probably the option least likely to be executed without a far more severe provocation than what has occurred so far. The second path is a smaller, targeted, asymmetric response, striking something of comparable economic weight elsewhere in the region without triggering the total catastrophe a full strait closure would guarantee. We have already watched smaller strikes on regional energy infrastructure move global oil markets measurably within hours during this conflict. A direct Iranian strike against Saudi or Emirati energy infrastructure or against a specific high-value commercial shipping target somewhere in the Gulf would be contained in scale relative to closing Hormuz entirely. But it would accomplish something strategically important for Tehran. It would place Iran back on the offensive side of the escalation timeline rather than simply reacting to Washington's decisions. And controlling the pace and direction of escalation, even partially, even temporarily, carries real strategic value when you are a government that just absorbed one of the most economically significant single military strikes in this entire conflict. The third path is what strategic analysts have begun calling the pivot and price approach. Iran accepts the loss at Kharg and works to shift its remaining operational export capacity toward its secondary terminals, Bandar Imam Khomeini on the mainland. The smaller loading facilities at Lavan and Siri, none of these individually, and none of them combined, can replace the volume Kharg was moving at full capacity, but together they represent a meaningful fraction of that volume, enough to maintain some level of revenue flow while the primary terminal undergoes whatever repair is realistically achievable under sanctions-constrained supply conditions. Russia, which has spent years building parallel infrastructure specifically for exporting sanctioned oil, and has developed genuine operational expertise in navigating exactly these kinds of supply chain constraints, becomes a more direct and more visible operational partner under this scenario. The oil keeps moving, at lower volume, at lower price, through longer and more expensive routes. But it moves, and the government in Tehran preserves something important: the image of a state that absorbed a serious blow, adapted, and kept functioning. That image matters internally almost as much as the revenue does. The fourth path is the one that generates the least immediate noise, and it is almost certainly the one that deserves the most careful attention. Iran deepens its investment in its regional proxy network, not necessarily by dramatically increasing the volume of weapons or financial support flowing to affiliated groups, but by converting its economic pressure into pure leverage pressure instead. The underlying message to any government considering further escalation becomes very simple. You cannot fully shut down what I am capable of projecting into this region without confronting every armed network I currently supply and coordinate. And confronting all of those networks simultaneously will cost you far more in blood, in treasure, and in time than whatever you gain by striking one island. This is not a new strategy for Iran. It is a strategy that has worked in various forms for 4 decades. And here's the counterintuitive danger sitting quietly at the center of this situation that planners in Washington need to think through very carefully. Weakening a government economically does not automatically reduce its willingness to use force elsewhere. In some historical cases, it does exactly the opposite. A government that still controls meaningful military instruments but has lost significant economic leverage may calculate that force is now its most reliable remaining asset. The loss of economic options can, in specific circumstances, make military options look more attractive by comparison, not less. That is the risk nobody's saying out loud clearly enough right now. And it is worth sitting with as the coming days unfold. Let's step back further and look at this strike in its full context, because examining it in isolation creates a misleading picture of where this conflict actually stands. This is without question the most economically significant single military action this conflict has produced. No earlier strike targeted infrastructure responsible for this large A share of a major oil-producing country's total export revenue in a single operation. Previous strikes hit military targets. They hit weapon storage. They hit command nodes. They hit radar systems and launch infrastructure. This strike hit the cash register. But it is not by itself a knockout blow. It is not a moment that strips Iran of its ability to act, to threaten, or to sustain the networks it has been building and funding for decades. Iran's government has survived comprehensive sanctions that effectively severed it from the global banking system. It has survived years of sustained military pressure during this conflict. It has absorbed losses that would have fundamentally destabilized governments with shallower institutional roots. This strike adds a genuinely new category of economic consequence to that history. But the architecture of the Iranian state, as frustrated and as damaged as it clearly is, was specifically designed over many years to survive exactly this kind of sustained pressure. The real question is not whether this strike represents a serious setback. It clearly does. The harder question, the one that analysts in every relevant capital are working through right now, is whether this specific blow pushes Iran's leadership toward a negotiating position it had previously refused to seriously consider, or whether it strips away enough of what Iran had left to protect that the regime now calculates there is simply less reason left to hold anything back. Those two outcomes, movement toward negotiation versus movement toward unconstrained escalation, can look nearly identical from the outside in the first several days after a strike like this one. They tend to look very different 6 weeks later, once the initial shock dissipates and the actual strategic decisions start revealing themselves in observable behavior. There are specific signals worth watching closely, because they will tell you far more than any official government statement. Watch whether Iran begins demonstrating increased operational activity at its secondary export terminals in ways that show up clearly on commercial satellite monitoring. If Tehran makes a visible effort to push Bandar Imam Khomeini or its smaller island terminals toward higher throughput, that is a strong signal the economic adaptation strategy is already underway, and that the regime has chosen revenue preservation over immediate military escalation as its first real response. Watch whether China issues any official acknowledgement of disruption to its Iranian oil supply arrangements. Beijing's silence or its comments, and the specific language it uses or avoids, will likely communicate more about the private conversations happening between governments than any formal diplomatic statement either side eventually publishes. Watch the actual ship movement data through the Strait of Hormuz. Not the political statements surrounding it, but the raw commercial tracking numbers that maritime monitoring services publish daily. Those numbers will reveal whether Iran is already applying quiet pressure on commercial shipping as a form of counter-leverage. And that kind of pressure typically shows up in the data well before any official Iranian response is publicly announced or acknowledged. Each of those threads connects back to the same question that sits at the very center of this story. For 13 consecutive nights, Washington made its intentions unmistakable. For 13 consecutive nights, Iran's leadership weighed whether the warnings were real, whether moving assets created more danger than absorbing the strike, whether diplomatic channels might still produce a resolution before the military track reached execution. Iran was wrong about at least one part of that calculation. But what this strike actually proves is not that Iran has been defeated, and it is not that this war is approaching any kind of clean conclusion. What it proves is that a threshold has been crossed. The threshold that previously protected civilian-adjacent economic infrastructure with direct global commodity market consequences from becoming a legitimate military target. That threshold held for months through repeated threats that never quite became action. The restraint behind it existed because crossing it meant accepting economic fallout that is genuinely difficult to contain once it starts moving through global markets. That restraint no longer holds the way it once did. And before we get to where this all leads, stick with us for one more moment. If this breakdown has helped you understand what's actually driving the headlines you're seeing right now, do something simple. Share this video with one person who you think needs to understand what Kharg Island actually is and what its loss actually means. Not everyone has the time to dig through the satellite data and the financial tracking numbers. You can hand them this. That one share matters more than you might think. Every government in the region is now quietly recalculating what the United States is genuinely prepared to target once it determines that the cost of restraint outweighs the cost of action. Every government watching from outside the region, with no troops anywhere near the Gulf, but significant stakes in global energy prices, is running that exact same calculation. The audience for this signal extends far beyond the Persian Gulf. It reaches every capital with energy infrastructure worth protecting, and every economy dependent on supply chains that run through this waterway. An island does not need an army to defend it. It needs one thing, the widely held Belief that attacking it directly would cost more than any attacker is willing to pay. Kharg Island had that protection for decades, not because it was militarily impenetrable, but because the economic consequences of striking it were understood to be unpredictable, far-reaching, and genuinely difficult to control once set in motion. That protection is gone now, and what replaces it, for Kharg, for the broader calculation of what is and isn't a legitimate target in this conflict, is something entirely different, something that every government in this region is currently working through with real urgency. What Iran does next will determine the true scale of what was actually lost here. Did it lose something recoverable? Something that gets patched together over the coming months through domestic engineering, Russian supply chain assistance, and alternative export routes, while the war grinds forward in patterns that have become uncomfortably familiar? Or did it lose something that permanently changes the cost calculation of this conflict for every party connected to it, and for every capital watching from what they assumed was a safe distance? Those two futures look nearly identical at the start. They very rarely stay that way. Somewhere tonight, in a household that has never heard of Kharg Island and likely never will, someone is looking at a fuel price or a utility estimate and wondering why the number is higher than they expected. They weren't planning for any of this to be part of their equation. They didn't choose this conflict. They didn't make any of the decisions that led to this moment. They are simply managing the downstream consequences of choices made in rooms thousands of miles from wherever they're sitting. That is what a threshold decision looks like from the ground level. Not strategy sessions, not satellite images, not commodity market charts updating in real time. Just a number on a screen somewhere that is slightly harder to absorb than it was last month, with no clear explanation attached, and no official acknowledgement that anyone made a choice that led here. The story is not finished. The real answer to every question we've worked through today will not come from a press statement or a political speech. It will come from what Iranian commanders actually decide to do, at sea, on land, through proxy networks, and at whatever negotiating tables are currently operating in cities far from the Persian Gulf. It will come from how Beijing moves, from how Gulf governments quietly reposition, from how global shipping companies calculate their risk exposure on routes that run through these waters. It will come from observable choices made by real people in real rooms who are right, now weighing everything they know against everything they stand to lose. That is the moment worth watching for. And when it arrives, when the next chapter of this story becomes clear enough to explain with the detail it deserves, we will be here to walk through it with you, the same way we walked through this one, clearly, carefully, without the noise. If this helped you understand what's really happening beneath the headlines, subscribe now so you're already here when the next chapter breaks. Because this story is moving fast, and the people who understand it early will be far better positioned than the people who catch up later. We'll see you in the next one.